Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our webinar on how to learn and teach Tanya. Tanya was first published in Tov Kuf Nun Zayin, 1797. The opening words of the first chapter of Tanya read, Tanya Besoif Perek Gimel Denida. Tanya, we learnt in a brisa, and the brisa is found at the end of the third chapter of the Gemara Nida. Now, on a simple level, the Alter Rebbe is telling us where this particular quote can be found at the end of the third chapter of the Gemara Nida. But the Rebbe points out that, in fact, there have been 3 chapters in the history of the world. The first chapter was from the time of the creation of Adam and Chava, from the time of the creation of Adam and Eve, until the birth of Abraham Avinu. And that was approximately 2,000 years. And that was the first chapter of the history of the world, the chapter called Chaos. Adam and Chava sinned, Adam and Eve sinned, Cain killed Abel, and the world just spiraled downward. The second chapter of history was from Abraham Avinu until the completion of the Gemara, and that took 2,000 years. And that was the chapter of Torah. Where had the Jews been for the last 2,000 years? In exile, in Golus. We're all in a state of niddah. We're all in a state of impurity. And what the Alter Rebbe was telling us is that when will Tanya be revealed to the world? When will this amazing teaching be revealed to the world at the end of the third chapter of the history of the world, the chapter called Niddah? This book, the teachings of this book come to pave the way for the revelation of Mashiach. And when Mashiach comes, there'll be no more war and no more suffering and no more sickness, no more jealousy. Godliness will be absolutely revealed in this world. It will be Ein Od Milvado. Now, there's never been a time for Mashiach to come than now. And as this pandemic spreads throughout the entire world, we have to make Tanya and we have to make Chassidus go viral, because that will bring Mashiach. Now, there's nobody better to teach us how to learn and teach Tanya than Rabbi Levi Wineberg, author, translator of Lessons in Tanya. Rabbi Wineberg, thank you for making the time, and over to you.
Thank you, Rabbi Mistinter. Welcome to all of you watching and listening wherever you are. What I'd like to present to you is several methods of looking at the Tanya and getting your audience to look at the Tanya, particularly in its opening chapters. A few words of introduction. Our Rebbe taught us that when a mechaber, an author of a sefer, tells us what he is out to accomplish with his sefer, we should actually take his word for it. So to speak, hold him to his claims. So when the Rebbe looked at a Rambam, and the Rambam said that his work, Mishnah Torah Yad HaChazoke, is halachas, the Rebbe taught us that everything in the Yad is halachas. Even if we see what looks like a prayerful interpolation, an exclamation by the Rambam, like for example in his laws of Pora Aduma, where parenthetically, while he's telling us how many Pora Adumas, how many red heifers have been offered since the first one was offered under Moshe Rabbeinu, so he concludes, the Rambam concludes his list, and the 10th one will be prepared by Moshiach Tzidkenu Meheiro Yegola. May he speedily be revealed. What is that? What are those 2 words? Meheiro Yegola. May he speedily be revealed. They sound like a hope. They sound like a prayer. But the Rebbe knows, in the Rambam, everything is halachas. So when the Rambam interjects with the 2 words, Meheiro Yigola, he's teaching us a halacha, that whenever we mention anything that has to do with the Rambam, we should express our hope, our desire, our looking forward for it to happen, because that's part of the emunah in Bias HaMoshiach, that we are hoping expectantly for his arrival. So the Rambam said 2 words, is the halacha. Rashi is pshuto shel mikra, the simple meaning of the text. And every once in a while, Rashi launches into something which looks a lot like Medrash, like Agoda, it's homiletic, it's poetic. No, everything is pshuto shel mikra, and if you fine-tune your reading of the Pasuk in Chumash, you will see that the plain sense of the word forces you to say what Rashi says it means. Okay, now with regard to Tanya, what do we know was the Alter Rebbe's objective in Tanya? So the Alter Rebbe says in his introduction, HaThomas HaMelakit, the compiler's foreword, he says that all these things that are written in Lekutei Amorim, Kulon Chubois al Shailois Rabois, they are all answers to the many questions which Anash, our fellowship Hasidim, have asked me in Yechidus, in private audiences. They've asked me questions about Avodas Hashem, and I responded to them. Now I've compiled and distilled and compressed all that into this book. So there you can find an answer for whatever question, difficulty you have in Avodas Hashem, and you will find relief for those things which oppress you in matters of Avodas Hashem. So let's take the Rebbe at his word. The Alter Rebbe at his word. So when we learn a line, surely a chapter of Tanya, we imagine ourselves in the shoes of some chosid who went into Yechidus to the Alter Rebbe with a difficulty, with a problem, a spiritual problem. It wasn't just an academic question. It says in the beginning of the third and the end of the third Perek of Nideh this way. And it says in Pirkei Avos, what seems the opposite? So what's the resolution? That's an academic question. That's not what the Alter Rebbe was out to accomplish by writing the Lekutei Amorim. By the way, you will have all sorts of answers in Mamorei Chazal and in Psukim and in Gemores and Midrashim, all sorts of things, explanations which will come up, by the way. But what's the Alter Rebbe out for? People going into him for Yechidus, presenting their difficulties and their hardships in Avodas Hashem, and the Alter Rebbe prescribes an eitzah. So when we look at a chapter of Tanya, we have to put ourselves in the shoes of that chosid, but we have to work it out backwards. If this is the answer, if the content of this chapter is the answer which the Alter Rebbe is providing, what must have been his question? And let's find in ourselves a similar kind of problem in Avodas Hashem, which the Alter Rebbe is answering for us, although we're living in a different milieu, in a different time. This was 250 years ago in Russia. People, shtetl Yidden, who came with their problems in Avodas Hashem, they usually were on a far, far more exalted spiritual level, even when they became Hasidim. They were just starting out. Even then, they were on a far more exalted spiritual Torah level than us. Nevertheless, we can find something within ourselves that we have an issue with, and we would like to go into Yechidus and ask and have the Alter Rebbe prescribe his advice for us. And by the way, as a little commercial, when you study lessons in Tanya with all of the Rebbe's explanations on the Alter Rebbe's words, what you have here is the Rebbe guiding us into Yechidus with the Alter Rebbe. And I would venture to say that the Alter Rebbe talking in his language and the Rebbe guiding us in so we can absorb it in our framework, in our time and place and mentality. So the Rebbe, with his comments, explanations, etc., which are found in the Shiurim in Tanya, the lessons in Tanya, the Rebbe is guiding us into Yechidus. So this is one way to look at the Tanya. If the Alter Rebbe is prescribing this as a remedy, what must have been the problem? If this is the answer, what must have been the problem? This is one approach. And I'll illustrate it with an example from the first chapter of Tanya, which I felt, for me personally, this is what the Alter Rebbe is addressing. Torah teaches us that when Rivka Imenu was expecting, she was very tormented. There's a war going on inside me. There's someone pulling toward Kedusha, toward Shul, toward Botim Medrash. There's someone pulling inside me in the exact opposite direction toward Avodah Zarah, toward heresy, toward Apikuris. What kind of child am I carrying here? She went to inquire of Hashem. She went into Yechidus with Shem ben Noach, who was the teacher at the time. And he said to her, Vayomer Hashem lo, Hashem said to her through the advice that she received from Shem, Shnei goyim bevitnech. You've got two nations within you. Yes, there's someone pulling right and someone pulling left because there are two someones. There's twins. These twins are very unlike each other. This is the Yaakov and an Esav, nicht fucking Yiddische Kinder gesagt. This is the two twins with completely different characters, different personalities. One is meant to be a Yaakov, one's meant to be an Esav. Now, every person can ask himself periodically, who am I? How do I have such contradictory desires and aspirations and gravitations? Who am I? Vayomer Hashem lo, Hashem tells us in Perek Aleph and Tanya, if we're puzzled about the opposite tendencies within us, Shnei goyim bevitnech. There are two nations within you. There are two nefoshes, two souls. Yes, one pulls this way, one pulls that way, as the Alter Rebbe will more fully explore in chapter 9, Perek Tes. But in the meantime, you must know, Shnei goyim bevitnech. You have two different souls. Now we all know from Chazal, from Gemara, from Medrash, that we all have two different yetzers, two different drives, the yetzer tov and the yetzer hora. But those are two different drives. So if I had the one drive, then that should cancel out the other drive. As the Alter Rebbe says further in Perek Ches, when he talks about a person who's disturbed by strange, extraneous thoughts in his davening, a person might get down and he'll say, oh, if I can have such strange thoughts in my davening, mikach she'ein tefillah se klum. Clearly, my tefillah is worthless. I'm not in it. I'm not really focused on Hashem, on what I'm saying. It's worthless. But the Alter Rebbe, no, the truth would be that way if you were but one person. But the truth is that you have two souls. The godly soul and the natural animal soul. And they pull in different directions. They have different goals, different desires. So one does not cancel out the other. That answers, who am I? Why am I so conflicted? Why am I so full of contradictions? Because I'm two. Now, my job is to reconcile the two, to have them live with each other. But the very same way that Rivka Imenu was mollified when she received the news, Shnei Goyim Bevitnech, there are two nations within you, that already solved her problem. Yes, she knew she would face hardship. She knew she would have an Esav to contend with. And there would be rivalry between the two sons. Not a happy thing, but she's placated. She's ruhig, she's calm, because Shnei Goyim Bevitnech. As soon as the Alter Rebbe tells us in chapter 1 that we have two distinct souls, two distinct personalities within us, he has already erased the dilemma and the confusion and the conflict, the big question of who am I really? He's erased that. Two souls are within you. So that's one way of looking at a chapter of Tanya, actually even at a line of Tanya, but it's easier to start with a chapter. What question does the Alter Rebbe address? What was the Chassid asking, or is the Chassid asking now, that the Alter Rebbe answers him with this chapter? That's one way. Now there's a book by an expert on thinking called 6 Frames. And he explains that a frame is a way of directing your attention. When you're looking for something, expecting to get some idea, some information in what you're reading, then you are more perceptive, you're more likely to pick up what you were looking for than if you were just looking at as a scenery, a landscape of a page. So he prescribes different frames. So we're going to do that now. And we'll look at Tanya through different frames. So here we have the next frame that we're going to look at, the Tanya through. And this frame is through another line that the Alter Rebbe says at the very beginning of Tanya. The Alter Rebbe teaches that he's here to tell us Eichu koroi ma'oid b'levovcho. The Torah tells us that the teachings of Torah are very near to our heart. We can fulfill them with our heart, with love of Hashem, with fear of Hashem, not just perfunctorily, not just in action or in speech, but with heart. And that seems far away from us. How is it korei ma'oid? How is it so near and so accessible that we can come to a love of Hashem and fear of Hashem? Especially nowadays, I mean, we hardly live with the kind of God consciousness that the Doir Hamidbar lived with in the days of the Beit HaMikdash, when people came Lirois Pnei Hashem, to be seen, to see and be seen by Hashem. There was a far greater God consciousness than we have. How is it so easy for us to come to love and to fear Hashem and do the mitzvahs motivated by that fear and love? So we can look at a chapter of Tanya and we ask ourselves, how does this chapter of Tanya help us to come closer to a heartfelt, to a deep-seated conviction and feeling in the service of Hashem that the Alter Rebbe is teaching us how we can come to? Now, in a big way, the Alter Rebbe maps it out. In the first 17 chapters, he maps out a method of coming to Avodas Hashem with love and fear through his bonus. meditation, reflection, deep thought. 18 through 26, he maps out another method of coming to love, mainly love, and also fear Hashem through remembering our innate, our natural love of Hashem. And we can plant that in every mitzvah that we do, as he describes there. So in a broad way, the Alter Rebbe is giving us different methods over the course of sections of the Tanya. But I think that since the Alter Rebbe wrote in the title page that it's Levayer Heitev, it comes to explain well, Eichu Korev Ma'oid, how is it very near to us to serve Hashem with heart? Whatever you learn in Tanya will enable you to come to a greater Avas Hashem and Yiras Hashem. It'll bring to the surface your natural love of Hashem. It'll enable you and equip you to think about Hashem in a way that will promote love and fear of Hashem to everything you approach through the frame of Korev Ma'oid. How is it very near to my heart? That's the second frame. So we move on. The Alter Rebbe had 3 chaverim, 2 of whom gave a haskoma, an approbation to the Tanya in writing. The third one who gave a verbal description of the Tanya. The 2 chaverim were Rabbi Yehuda Leib HaKoyen, who was a colleague of the Alter Rebbe. Remember, the Alter Rebbe was the youngest student of the Mezritcher Maggid. He was younger by 40-something years than his elder colleagues like Reb Mendel Vitebsker. So he was very friendly with many of his fellow Talmidim of the Maggid. So one of them was Rabbi Yehuda Leib HaKoyen. He writes an approbation on the Tanya, and he signed that approbation toward the end of the year Tov Kuf Nun Vov 1796. In writing the approbation, he wrote the name of the year as Tov Kuf Nun Vov, and he said that the letters Tov Kuf Nun Vov 556, 5,556, 5,000 isn't written, 556, Tov Kuf Nun Vov stands for Tanya Ketoires Nefesh Veruach. Tanya is the Ketoires, like an incense for the soul, the Nefesh and the Ruach. What Ketoires? So we know that Ketoires wards off plagues. If there are diseases, if there are plagues rampant among the people, Rahman al-Islam, as it happened, for example, in the aftermath of the rebellion by Korach and his cronies, so there was a plague. So Moshe told Aaron, run quickly and offer the Ketoires, the incense, and that will stop the plague. So Rabbi Yehuda Leib HaKoyen is saying that the Tanya is the Ketoires, like an incense, to get rid of spiritual malaise, spiritual problems. The other colleague of the Alter Rebbe, very good friend, Reb Zusha Annepoller, he also wrote an approbation, and he said when he was writing the approbation that with this sefer we will go toward Moshiach Tzidkenu. Now he wrote the date, the year when he signed as Pidustenu. Pidustenu adds up to 556. You can do the arithmetic yourself. Pidustenu, which means our redemption. And that ties in with what he said, that with this book, we will go toward Moshiach Tzidkenu. So again, Rabbi Yehuda Leib HaKohen sees the Tanya as a spiritual remedy, aketoides, and incense to ward off all sorts of spiritual plagues and illnesses. Rabbi Zusha sees it as the way to go forward to Mashiach Tzidkenu. Now, both of these are lenses and frames by which we can look at the Tanya through each one. How does this serve as a lens and a frame for looking at Tanya? So I'll explain it by means of a sticha that the Rebbe once said, Achron Shol Pesach and Yutes Kislev, two different occasions. And the Rebbe explained a story which is well known among Hasidim. The first story is two stories. The first story is that when the Alter Rebbe was still young and a student of the Mezritcher Maggid, the Mezritcher Maggid had a vision that on high there was a big kitrug, an accusation, and aspersion was cast on the fact that was spreading Hasidus, and Hasidus is such a special, holy, precious teaching, the inner aspects of Torah. How do we spread it abroad for everybody? The Alter Rebbe dispelled that accusation on high by explaining to someone else. I won't go into the details of the story, but many of you know it. The Alter Rebbe explained by means of a moshel. The moshel is very well known, so I'll keep it brief. There's a prince who's very ill. He's so ill, no one can find a remedy for him. Meanwhile, someone is summoned to the palace, and he discovers that in the king's crown, there's a centerpiece of a jewel. If you ground down that precious gem into a powder, mix it with water, and give it to the prince spoonfuls, it'll cure him. But, that gem is the centerpiece of the crown. That's the beauty of the crown. How do you grind down such a gemstone into a powder? So while the ministers are thinking and discussing, the prince became so ill that there was grave doubt whether he'll be able to take a teaspoonful of this powder mixed with water. So it could be that the gemstone will be ground down into a powder, but the prince won't even be able to take it in. Maybe they'll have to give it to him with a little bottle dropper. And even then, most of it will spill. And the king said, my son, my child's life is so precious to me, far more than my crown. Grind down the gemstone, make a powder out of it, feed it to the child. Whatever will enter, will enter. Maybe some of it will spill, maybe most of it will spill. But his life will be saved. And that was an example for how Chassidus, which is the gem in the crown of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the crown of the Torah, is ground down into simple language in order to be able, for us to be able to absorb something of it. And that moshel of the Alter Rebbe took away the accusation on high against the spreading and teaching of Chassidus. Fast forward 25 years or so. The Alter Rebbe is arrested, more than 25, but 30 years. The Alter Rebbe is arrested. He's in Petersburg. He's taken as a rebel, as a traitor, as a renegade against the Tsar, and it doesn't look good. The Alter Rebbe is in jail, and he is visited by, don't ask me how, he's visited by his Rebbe, the Mezritcher Maggid, and his Rebbe, the Baal Shem Tov, who tell him that the reason he was arrested and the reason he's suffering is because he's spreading Hasidus in a way of intellectual understanding, not just like Kabbalah, but he's bringing it into intellect, Chabad. Now, whatever happened with the Alter Rebbe and the Baal Shem Tov, the Alter Rebbe asked, so when I'm free, should I stop? He said, on the contrary, do it all the more. Explain it further so that everyone can understand it. But the Rebbe picks up on the point that 30 years later, after the Alter Rebbe had removed the kitrug, the accusation against spreading Hasidus in the days of the Mezritcha Magid, 30 years later, here it is again, another accusation on high, and he's imprisoned because of that. That accusation was dispelled, case dismissed. Rebbe explained that there are two ways of learning Hasidus. One way is as a remedy for the ailments, for the sickness of the crown prince, Klal Yisrael. Yidden had fallen into a low state, whether because of the Tach V'Tat, the Khmelnytsky massacres, or whether because of in the aftermath of Shabtai Tzvi Shmoi, all sorts of reasons they had fallen into a very deep low and depression and a lowly state. In order to elevate them from that state, you need the gemstone from the king's crown. That was one accusation which was dispelled when the Hasidus was taught as a remedy. A remedy, how much do you take a medicine? A teaspoonful, and that itself is the dilution and a concentration of a little bit, a tiny bit. Then there's another way of learning Hasidus. Hasidus can also be studied as a preparation for Mashiach. Like on Friday afternoon, you have a piece of the Shabbos Kugel, a foretaste of the delights of Shabbos. So Hasidus is some of the Torah of Mashiach as a foretaste. I never saw anybody nibble on a kugel Friday afternoon. You have a helping of kugel, it's a night healthy helping. So Hasidus began to be studied not just as little fragments, but Alter Rebbe is now explaining it. He's doing the foretaste of Shabbos on Friday afternoon before Shabbos, before Mashiach comes, and he's giving us a generous helping that aroused another accusation against that type of spreading Hasidus. Now, if we think about it, these two types of learning Hasidus are actually what are described by Rabbi Yehuda Leib HaKohen and by Reb Zusha, respectively. Reb Yehuda Leib HaKohen is saying that Tanya is ketoiris. The nefesh v'ruach is the remedy for all kinds of ailments, spiritual ailments of the nefesh and the ruach. That is the approbation for the Tanya. That's his way of learning the Tanya. Reb Zusha is saying that with this sefer we'll go forward to Mashiach Tzidkenu, and this is the sefer which gives us a foretaste of the Torah of Mashiach in the time of Golus yet. And he signs his approbation as Piduseinu, our redemption. So here we have another frame, another way of looking at the Tanya. You look at a chapter of Tanya and you say to yourself, what kind of spiritual ailment, what kind of bad midah, what kind of way in which my nefesh habahamis, my animal soul overpowers me. How does this chapter or this section of Tanya help me to overcome that malady, that ailment? Then there's another way. in which you can look at a section of Tanya, a piece of Tanya, and say to yourself, how does this piece of Tanya help me to develop a Mashiach consciousness? How does it extricate me from a narrow vision, tunnel vision, golus mentality, and open me to an Einoid Milvadoi, Hashem all over, Benigla Kvoid Hashem, Hashem is revealed all over, and I'll look at the world that way. How does this piece enable me to develop that consciousness? Last one. Rabbi Yitzchok of Badichev, very, very good friend of the Alter Rebbe, who ended up being a mechutin because their children, their grandchildren married each other. Rabbi Yitzchok didn't actually write an approbation, but when he saw the manuscript of the Tanya, he exclaimed, Uva, akun, reinstellen a da größer Gott in a da klein table. What a trick to put such a great God into such a small book. What's the Badishev's thing? With every piece of Tanya that we learn, we should develop a greater conception of what Hashem is. A größer Gott. It could be that we have a very petty conception of Hashem. Kind of the way a child might think of his parents. You know what a little child thinks about a parent? They don't have an existence in their own right. But being that I wouldn't be able to eat or sleep or have clothes or have a house without parent, so Hashem made sure that when I was born, there would also be these parents who would be around, and they would give me clothing and shelter and food. So they are like tag-alongs to me. I am. They are accessories to me. You know, we can think about Hashem in the same way. Why do we need Hashem? Because, without him, how would we have our need? How would we have our religious leanings and expressions? So the Eibishter helped that he made himself available to us. He's like a tag-along, an accessory to us. He's the provider, he's the maker, he's the doer. He's very big and powerful, but he's kind of a second thought after ourselves. So once we realize that we need a God who will enable and enhance and empower us. We need a much bigger vision of Hashem. We need a vision of Hashem who's bigger than me and bigger than his world, and he's not dependent on me and nor on his world, nor any one of his beings, as the Rambam said at the very beginning of his Mishnah Torah. We need a größer Gott. We need to escape our narrow vision of what Hashem is. Come to a realization that on the contrary, Hashem encompasses all, Einoid Milvadoi, and a plain tefel. We don't need a whole lot of material, a whole lot of text in order that we can come to this realization. We can get it in a line. The Rebbe told a story on Purim in 1958, Tovshin Chai, that there was a chosted of the Alter Rebbe, who was a fairly average fellow, no great intellectual. You wouldn't think he had a lot of material to think about and meditate on. But his davening, wow. And the Alter Rebbe went through all the days of the week. He davened Sunday and Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday and Thursday and Friday, and Shabbos goes without saying. And they asked him, what are you davening with? What are you thinking about so much? He said, I don't know about thinking. I just know that I once heard the Alter Rebbe say decades. As da größter Gott in as da klein Sefer, contained in a word, in a phrase, is a new conception of Hashem. And that brings us to our last frame, that when we learn a line of Tanya, we have to ask ourselves, what new conception do I have in the greatness of Hashem, and how I can put it into every little detail of my Torah study, of my observance of a mitzvah, of my davening. How can I put this größter Gott in a klein Sefer? What do we have so far? 5 frames. Frame number 1. The Alter Rebbe says that Likutei Amorim particularly is an answer to many of the queries and the questions and the difficulties which Hasidim put to me. So when we learn a piece of Tanya, the Alter Rebbe is giving advice, he's giving an answer. What was the question that the Chosid asked, and how might I relate to that question? Developing Avodas Hashem. Number 2, the Alter Rebbe says in the title page of Tanya that the Tanya is there to teach us how it's koremioid, it's very near, very accessible, easy. Might take work, but it's accessible. That everything in Torah can be done with heart. All my avodas Hashem will not just be done, action, speech, or even conscious thought when I'm supposed to think something, but it should be with heart. Avas Hashem, Yiras Hashem. Doesn't seem close. Tanya will teach us how. So we look at a piece of Tanya and we say, how did this piece enable me to approach Torah with heart, with Avas Hashem and Yiras Hashem? 3. Rabbi Yehuda Leib HaKohen, who said that the Tanya is the Ketoires, is the remedy and like incense for spiritual maladies, magefes, plagues. So when we look at Tanya, we ask ourselves, which bad midah, which bad trait, or which habit, or what is it, my malady, a way of thinking, an attitude, a feeling toward other people, toward Hashem. What is that malady that Tanya is the Ketoir is for? Number 4, Reb Zusha said that the Tanya is Pidus Teinu, our redemption. We will go out of Golus with it. And how does each part of Tanya enable us to develop a Mashiach consciousness, to live like we will in the days of Mashiach? Like the piece of kugel on Friday afternoon, we're absorbing now in advance the type of mentality which will be natural when Mashiach comes. And finally, number 5, the words of the Badichever, Azag größter Gott, what a great God and what a little book, developing a greater conception of Hashem and putting it into the smallest details of our lives, of our avodas Hashem, of our mitzvahs, of our davening, of our Torah. These are 5 frames. Now, we don't have time to go through an illustration of each one, maybe some other occasion, but at any rate, these are mixed and match. I don't suppose every piece you're able to apply all 5 frames, but they're all there for you. Take one and apply it, but for every piece of Tanya, apply at least one of them. When you remind yourself to look for this idea, to look for Mashiach consciousness, to look for a way out of spiritual malaise, you will find it in the words of Tanya. It'll jump out at you like the letters of the Urim V'Tumim. When the Kohen looked at the Urim V'Tumim, when did the letters jump out at him? When he had a question. Otherwise, there were letters enticed in the stones of the Choshen of the breastplate. When did they shine? When did they light up? when he had a question to ask Hashem. He needed the answer. That's when the letters shone. When we're looking for an answer to these questions in one of these 5 forms, possibly more, you can come up with your own. But when we're looking through a frame, the letters will jump out at us. So I wish you all atzlocha in learning and teaching Tanya in such a way that you arouse in your student, in yourselves, all that Agroiser Gott and Moshiach consciousness and an end to the illnesses, whether physical or spiritual, and lots of atzlocha.
Thank you very, very much, Rabbi Wineberg. That was a great insight into Tanya. Just for the attendees who don't know the family structure over here, so I am Rabbi Wineberg's son, and the lessons in Tanya, which Rabbi Wineberg quoted, is Rabbi Wineberg's father. So this is like the Gemara says, thank God, Tanya is a great gift that our Zayda has passed down to us. We are very grateful for that. And we really appreciate the insight you shared with us, Rabbi Wineberg. To quote my grandfather, he would often say that I'm not a mechadesh. I'm not somebody who innovates ideas. I just quote from what I was taught. But your father, mentioning about Rabbi Wineberg, is a mechadesh. He comes up with so many novel ideas and perspectives, and that's what we tremendously gained from tonight, the amazing insight into how to take the vision that the Alter Rebbe had for Tanya and the approbations of the teachers of Tanya, and to use them as glasses, as frames when we're learning Tanya. Now, there were quite a lot of questions that have come up throughout the class. What I'm going to do is, I don't know if this is acceptable on a Zoom panel, but we're going to do it anyway. And then I'm going to actually post all the questions to all the attendees, because obviously not all the questions will be able to be answered now. And perhaps some of these questions are bothering you as well. And you could just peruse through them. We'll ask maybe Rabbi Wineberg to choose one of the questions that have come up to answer. Rabbi Wineberg, if you maybe want to look through any of these questions, do any of them, would you like to address any of them in particular?
I see people who wrote that they have no question. That's the whole point. Someone says, do we mean to say that every problem that a person may have is addressed in the Tanya? And if the Tanya for questions of those days, how does it solve problems of our day? And it seemed academic. Why does it matter what the questioner was thinking? Where do I look to find my question? Okay, let's take that little by little. Am I saying that every question that someone may have who will find an answer for in the Tanya? The Alter Rebbe himself said no. Someone has his microphone on, please mute. The Alter Rebbe himself in his introduction said no. You may very well not find the answer to your question in Tanya. So what do? The Tanya is meant to work with a mashpia. The Alter Rebbe says, address your issue to the elders in your town, and they, the elders, will help you to understand. So it's a two-tiered system. It's a book together with some personal guidance. So it's very possible that you won't see how Tanya addresses your concern. The Alter Rebbe says, I realize that. I, for my part, the Alter Rebbe says, I've addressed the issues. I've looked down okay, I'm paraphrasing. The Alter Rebbe didn't whisper in my ears exactly, but this is more or less what he's saying. I, for my part, have seen the neshamas through the generation, and I know who will have queries to ask me. I've addressed it for my part. Will that necessarily mean that you are able to glean an understanding, an answer from what I've written? Not necessarily. And that's where the other tier comes in, and that's the mashpia. A mashpia who knows us, and he knows our setting and our situation, and he's able to apply what the Alter Rebbe wrote in Tanya to our situation. I think today we are blessed with quite a number of mashpiim who, in a big way, over the net, over YouTube, are explaining in contemporary terms that which the Alter Rebbe put in his language in 250 years ago. But it's important to have that mashpia. So yes, the Alter Rebbe addressed it, but no, you might not be able to get the answer. You might need help. And that's also what I had in mind when I said that the Alter Rebbe is taking us, the Rebbe is taking us into Yechidus to the Alter Rebbe. Why do we need the Rebbe to take us into Yechidus to the Alter Rebbe? Because the Rebbe is the one who can open up for us, who has opened up for us, the pathways of Chassidus, which were couched in a very different language and style and milieu. And he's opened it up to us in a way that we can relate to, that relates to us. And yes, it goes back to the Rebbe, to the Alter Rebbe. As the Rebbe said himself in his first Farbrengen, that the end goal is the Doir Hashvi'i, the seventh generation, the Rebbe's generation. But the seventh is the seventh because we count from the first. We count from the Alter Rebbe. We're not starting with the Rebbe. The Rebbe is our way of absorbing the teachings going back to the Alter Rebbe. So that's more or less the answer to that query. Those who have no questions, you're meant to have questions. If you don't have questions, it doesn't come from having the answers. There's a ticker in many offices. If you're not close to having a nervous breakdown, you obviously don't know what's going on. Well, I'm not recommending nervous breakdown, chas v'sholem, but if you don't have questions, it means that you're not thinking. That doesn't mean that you have answers. But you should have. The very condition of a person, and a Yid especially, is that he had the question. He's born with a question. They used to say, how much time have we got? They used to say that anyone who ate of the kasher of Tomchet Mimim won't die without tshuva. What the kasher? The kasher was the breakfast cereal of Tomchet Mimim. I think the kasher of Tomchet Mimim is, what am I doing in this world? Why am I here? Why did Hashem need me? Why do I need to be here? At the kasher of Tomchet Mimim, it's a burning question which everyone has to have. Now, last point. Someone said that the first few lines of Tanya don't seem to answer any question. I'd love to hand that over to you. But if it were me, and I was going into Yechidus in the Alter Rebbe's day, and I was coming from a non-Hasidic background, I would have a huge question, which in fact bothered many, many, many people at the time. We all know that in the Baal Shem Tov's time, the average attitude of a firm Jew was downcast. In fact, that was the holy attitude. You were downcast, the sky's falling on my head. It's terrible, and I'm terrible. And how can I possibly approach Avodas Hashem with confidence? How can I believe in myself and in my potential, and at the same time that I see myself as so worthless? But this is not just an academic question to resolve a Breiste in Masechta Nida with a Mishnah in Pirkei Avos. In Masechta Nida it says, regard yourself as a Rosha, and in Pirkei Avos it says, Al tihi Rosha b'fnei atzmacha, don't be a Rosha, a wicked person in your own estimation. It's not just an academic question. I have a source, I have another source. How do you resolve them? Close both books. Close Masechta Nida, close Pirkei Avos, and I ask you, how do you look at yourself? Valuable or worthless? If valuable, how do you avoid that getting to you and feeling entitled and free to do what you want? If worthless, how do you get yourself motivated? What difference does it make what I do, what I don't do? Why should I give myself a hard time and restrict myself? Whatever I do, in any case, not worth anything. Which is a trick of the Yetzer Hara, as the Alter Rebbe says further in chapter 27. It's a trick of the Yetzer Hara to get us into depression so that we will end up with self-gratification, because a person who feels depressed, he looks to satisfy himself by gratifying himself. So it's a trick of the Yetzer Hara. But how do I look at myself? I don't know that there's a Breiste in Nida that be a Rosha in your own eyes. I don't know, let's say, that there's a Mishnah in Pirkei Avos that don't be a Rosh in your own estimation. If I ask you a straight question, how do you regard yourself? Especially in the days of the Alter Rebbe, coming from an un-Hasidic background, what am I supposed to look at myself as? Tanya addresses it. Yes. Can't go into it now, but look at chapter 27. Okay, we'll have to leave it at that. Thank you very much for joining. This has just been up in Spitzgoppel, a bit at the edge of the fork, a taste. And Zil Gemoyer, go ahead, immerse yourself in it, bring along others, teach others. And that's the way the Alter Rebbe meant Tanya to be taught. Like I said, 2-tier system, so be a teacher for others as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Wineberg.
Thank you. Firstly, Mazel Tov, Rabbi Zevi Wineberg and Rabbi Wineberg. May you grow Torah l'chupra masim tovim. And if I could say, it's been an absolute privilege. So Rabbi Wineberg, both of you, thank you so much for giving me of your time for Tanya Talks. You've given us the opportunity to learn, understand, and appreciate Tanya in a much better way. So thank you.
Yeah.
And to all who joined, thank you guys, and please join us tomorrow night.